You're listening to the Wool Academy podcast. This is episode number 54.
Hello and welcome. My name is Elisabeth van Delden, and once a week we talk to an industry expert from the wool industry supply chain from farm to fashion and beyond, delivering strategies and insights to be successful in wool and showcasing those beautiful stories wool has to tell.
Today's guest is Stephen Russell. Stephen is a professor of textile materials and technology at the University of Leeds. He's a specialist in non-woven material technology and non-woven fabric manufacture. In our interview today, Stephen will talk especially about recycling and wool. Welcome, Stephen. It is a pleasure to have you on the show today. How are you?
Thank you, Elisabeth. I'm fine, thank you. I feel lucky already because it's not raining outside.
Yes.
Based in the north of England, that's always a pleasure and a delight when we have a rest from the bad weather.
That's true. It's also nice and sunny here in Germany, so we feel lucky today. I would like to ask you to just start talking about yourself and tell us about the work that you do.
Thank you, Elisabeth. Yes, well, I'm Professor of Textile Materials and Technology at the University of Leeds. Leeds, of course, has a very long history of activity in teaching and research in textiles, going right back to 1874, and at that time working very heavily with the wool industry, and that's continued since. In my role, I'm really focused on research. I do quite a lot of teaching as well, but my main interest is in research, working with a really diverse bunch of people, very multidisciplinary, with lots of interests across traditional textile technology all the way through to areas such as implantable medical devices and healthcare. So it really is diverse. And then in addition, I suppose I'm a bit of a strange academic because I'm also very interested in commercial work as well. And I'm technical director of a university spin-out company called NIRI that was set up in 2005, which is really a consultancy company and a near-to-market product development service for the industry. So that's a rather long introduction, but I have lots of things to do.
Yes. Yeah, and it was quite difficult to find a date for this interview, so I think we can say that you are a very busy man. And who would be your typical customers at your non-woven innovation and research institute?
It could be a raw material supplier. It could be a manufacturer. It could be a converter of fabric into finished product. And most of the time, it's very, very sensitive, very, very critical type work with very short deadlines. It's fascinating because it's very different to academic research because it needs to be done very quickly, and you need to make a quick decision, and it potentially has a very big impact.
You probably always
if
need
you
to
don't get it right.
Yeah, and you have to have probably always some relation to the bottom line.
Of course, yes, of course, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and today we're going to talk a lot about recycling. So maybe you could start by giving us an introduction to textile recycling. What all do we need to know about textile recycling?
Well, I think the first thing to say is, like textiles generally, the recycling activity is a big industry. It's a globally connected and globally operating industry too, with operations everywhere. And there are traditional centres of textile recycling in Europe and in Asia in particular. But I think the first thing to be clear about is that it is an industry, and that means that for it to operate, it has to have markets. And basically what's happening is that clothing consumed in the developed world, which could be Europe, North America, Asia, and so on, and elsewhere, is either reused or recycled elsewhere, and that's not necessarily in those same countries. It's often exported to other places where the recycling or reuse takes place. So that collection, reuse, and recycling infrastructure only exists if there's a market for the material that's being collected. And whatever there is, there's an incentive to do the collection and to keep the industry moving and developing. And it's interesting, really, because here in the UK, along with, I think, the USA and Germany, we're the largest exporters of used textiles. And in the UK, the biggest destinations are sub-Saharan Africa, other parts of the EU actually, and also North Africa too, and parts of the Middle East. So these are clothes that have had a first life. They're collected. This is obviously all driven by the value of that product, and then it's exported to different places to be reconsumed in a second life. So I think the most important thing is that to have in mind is that we're talking about an industry. It uses very interesting technology, but the technology is no use if there's no market for the product. And luckily there is a market, although it can be an up and down one, as is often the case in textiles generally.
And did you see, I mean, you just said it's an up and down market, but did you see over the recent years that there's a higher demand for recycling?
I think it depends on the products you're talking about. You see, we also have an increasing volume of fast fashion clothing, for example, coming onto the market, which in some areas has had an effect on the ability of clothes that are collected to be sold for reuse because the price points are similar. So it really depends on the product and on the particular fibre it contains, and it is a tricky situation, and also what the collectors would really like to have is the very high value clothing, which isn't necessarily or definitely isn't the largest proportion of what's actually donated by consumers. So it's an interesting area, and it's difficult to generalize the market because of as it is in conventional textiles as well.
Okay. And is there, I mean, I don't know if you can maybe give us some numbers of how many textiles actually do get recycled, and also if there's a difference among the different fibers. So you already said, fast fashion has an impact, but then maybe also is there a difference for fiber types?
Well, there's a difference in the commercial value for different fiber types. I mean, I think the first thing to say is that how much gets recycled, just to answer that part of your question, really depends on. It really comes back to the consumer, because unless that clothing is donated and not put in the bin, honestly, it won't be recaptured for reuse or recycling. I saw a recent article in the UK. I think it said that roughly 3/4 of consumers had admitted to binning their discarded garments because they just didn't realise that if it was worn out, it could still be recycled, and it can. So even clothing that's completely worn out can still be recycled. It can't be necessarily reused, but it can be recycled, and that's the key part. How much we can recycle realistically depends on how much can be collected, and that depends fundamentally on consumers to donate those products at the end of life and not put them in the domestic waste bin. And realistically, again, about 95% of the textile material that's currently being landfilled, because it's been put in the bin, could technically be recycled had it have been donated. So that's another interesting thought, that just that decision at the point of disposal makes such a massive difference in terms of the destiny of that fibre embodied in the fabric, and what happens next. In terms of actual amounts, I think in the UK, from memory, I think we're consuming about just over 1 million tons of clothing per annum, which is rising actually, despite the economic situation. And about 650,000 tons of that is collected, so through donations. So quite a significant proportion is being collected, and that's an estimate, clearly, because one of the issues in this area is getting good data on what the statistics really are, and it varies hugely from country to country. So in Europe, the places like the UK are not so bad. Elsewhere in the world, those donation rates, those collection rates are much lower, and there's a lot more to do to persuade consumers to donate, and then for infrastructure to develop to handle that donated material. And I think the other issue I'll just mention too, which I think also has an impact, is collecting and donating alone. I mentioned this a little earlier, but I think it's important, is fine. But as we recycle more material in the future, we really need to develop a wider range of sustainable markets for that material to go into, in order to ensure that values remain sufficiently high to pay for the collection infrastructure. So that's just another technical point. If, as I said before, technically you can do many more things than you can do commercially. If the price point's not right, it's not likely to happen.
You talk about that, there needs to be a lot of change on the one hand, how things are collected and consumer mindsets. And also recently, a lot of like the European Union has talked a lot about circular economy. So is circular economy just a fancy word for recycling, or is there more to it as well?
It's definitely not a fancy word for recycling. I mean, the circular economy is really a transformational way of looking at the way that we do things. It's a completely alternative approach to, what's been the traditional linear economy of, making stuff, using stuff, and then disposing of it without really worrying where it's going or what's happening to it. And the whole point of this, of course, is to accept that textile fibers, including wool, are valuable resources, and we need to keep them in use for as long as possible and extract as much value as we can from them at every stage. But in fact, if we're to make the economy truly circular, then the material that we put into that economy needs to be recovered and regenerated into real products at the end. So that's where recycling and reuse comes in, to make that possible, to give the material additional service life opportunities. So to get away from this idea that we make something, we use it, get rid of it at the end of the first life, and we're thinking before we even begin at the design stage how we can make a second life, a third life, a fourth life possible, and what we need to do early on to encourage and to enable that to happen. Yeah, so I think just to summarize that, I mean, if you condense that down to the raw essentials, for that to really happen, it needs people to do things differently. It needs technology to be able to do it economically, and it needs the markets for the end products so that those extra surface lives can actually happen.
But do you think these discussions that are happening around circular economy will then actually help get the ball rolling?
Yes, certainly. I think there's been a huge amount of progress in the last 5 years in particular. Organisations like the Ellen MacArthur Foundation have made this issue much more understood by the general public as well as by others in the industry. And as a result, people are now trying things that I don't think they would have otherwise tried. And we now start to see tools that people can use to make this happen. So as with many things, it's not going to happen overnight. It'll be a process of stepping rather than an immediate step change. But I think that way of thinking is pretty well embedded now, and we're starting to see some real progress.
Okay, well, thank you for giving us kind of this overview and introduction to textile recycling. And I once heard you say that wool industry is actually one of the oldest circular economy within the textile industry. Can you tell us a little bit more about that thought?
Yes. Well, yes. I think I'm trying to remember where I said that, but I'll take your word for it. but yes. If you go back where I'm sitting now, just I guess 20 minutes from where I'm sitting now here in Leeds, it was around the early 1800s. I think it was 1813. There was a gentleman called Benjamin Law, who was based in Batley, just south of here, who developed a process of recycling wool rags into new textile products, and that process was described eventually as the shoddy process, and then a few years later the Mungo process was developed. But both had in common the technology to convert post-consumer textile clothing into fibre that could then be used to make clothing and related garments again. And at its height, I think by the mid-1850s, roughly 15,000 tons of that material, mungo and shoddy, was being sorted and processed into yarn not far from here. So that was a pretty big quantity, a big proportion of the wool industry's output from this region at that time contained what was effectively post-consumer waste wool, and it was a big industry, and it was part of why Yorkshire became famous for textiles, and then a similar activity developed later commercially in northern Italy, in Prato. That still exists, doing very similar things. The industry generally, the number of organisations doing that type of recycling has reduced considerably over the years, but it certainly hasn't died out, and in fact there's a bit of a resurgence now that some of this know-how is being rediscovered. So I use that particular example because it wasn't craft activity, it wasn't very small scale, it was big industry, and we can learn a lot by looking back. Just not that long ago, looking back sometimes gives us really good firm grounding to look forward, and that's one area where I think we can demonstrate turning post-consumer wool into valuable product with a commercial value in particular is possible.
Yeah, so learning from the past and updating it for today.
Yes.
Mm. And can you maybe take us through a typical circular life of wool that is first manufactured as virgin wool into a product and then reused and recycled?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are really two approaches to that in relation to wool. One is closed loop recycling, which the Mungo example I just mentioned is a classic example of. And there what you're doing is taking post-consumer clothing, so assuming the garment has been donated, we can then effectively shred it back down into fibre, and we can blend that recycled fibre with virgin fibre, so let's say virgin wool, to modulate the physical properties of the blend. and then effectively put that blend through the same processes, let's say the woolen spinning system, to make yarn and then fabric again, which can go into articles of clothing or accessories with a relatively high economic value depending on how the blend was originally put together. So this idea of closing the loop means that we are effectively putting that fibre back into a very similar product. The economic value therefore is relatively high. And then the other approach, which is relevant to wool, in fact, at the moment it's the biggest recycled market for wool. A closed loop was, but now it's open loop. And that's a process of, again, shredding the fibre down from its original garment form into loose fibre that can then be, let's say, carded into a web and then made into either spun products, but more usually into non-woven products, which are used in markets such as mattress insulator pads, other insulation products, where the economic value is lower, but where the service life of the final product could be longer than the first life. So, normally people keep their mattresses longer than they keep their wool socks. Well, I do anyway. I'm not sure about some of my students. I'd need to find out. But
Yeah.
that's a very good example of how, from a circular economy perspective, you can keep the fibre in circulation for a lot longer than otherwise would have been possible. Not many people would instinctively think that the second life could be longer than the first. And putting wool into mattress insulator pads over the springs to protect the layers above is a really good example of where that's done commercially, and where it has been done commercially for many, many years. Historically, it's mainly been to meet fire retardancy regulations, which, of course, wool helps those manufacturers to satisfy because of its inherent properties, its inherent physical properties, which are not destroyed through the recycling process. The fibre may be shortened, but the basic chemistry of the fibre remains the same, and therefore its functionality can still be really very useful.
Does wool lend itself quite well to the recycling and reuse process? Are its properties quite special in that regard?
I think yes, in the sense that compared to many other fibres, when you are recycling wool, the fibre length is relatively long to start with. So if there's a little bit of shortening during mechanical recycling, it's still possible to process the fibre later without losing most of it on the floor. So that's very useful. As I mentioned, the inherent properties of wool itself are not really hugely affected by the recycling process. So if you need fibre with good fire retardancy, if you need fibre with good inherent thermal insulation and so on, then you can still have it in a recycled product. And I think also, I think the other thing to say is that with some other fibres, man-made fibres in particular, mechanical recycling can lead to thermal damage because of the thermoplasticity of some of those materials. And also at the end, the economic value of the recycled material might actually be so low that the markets really become very small, and therefore the demand for those sorts of fibres is less. And we're seeing other recycling processes emerge which could address that in the future using chemical methods, for example.
And nowadays we also have a lot of fiber blends, so wool with polyester or nylon, etc. How does that affect the recycling then?
Well, blending actually often is a problem for recyclers, because obviously with most recycled materials, the economic value of the recyclate is a function of knowing what you have and what the physical properties of that material is. So if you recycle metals, for example, the economic value of recycled metals isn't far away from the virgin price of the recycled metal, because the recycling process doesn't greatly affect the physical properties of the material, and therefore you can use it for similar things. In the case of textiles, it's more difficult, because we do have an influence on the dimensions of the fiber during recycling, and with blending in particular, if we don't know what we're processing, if we know it's got cotton in there, it's got polyester in there, it's got a bit of wool in there, but we don't know what the proportions of each are, and we can't say that those proportions are consistent, then obviously you can't expect that material to have the same economic value or be able to be directed to the same markets. One of the advantages of the wool mark is that it indicates a very wool-rich composition, and having 100% wool and being able to say it's 100% wool is very useful, because for the reasons I mentioned earlier on.
And how do these garments actually then get sorted? Is that all done currently by hand, or are there also machines that can sort?
Currently, it's mostly all done by hand and by very, very skilled people. So you have conveyor belts with clothing moving along, with very skilled people picking and placing garments and sorting very often into hundreds of different grades based on fiber composition, color, and other factors. There is work going on to automate sorting, and some of that work looks quite promising, and some of it has been installed commercially, but the vast majority of sorting in terms of the volume of garments moving through sorting operations is still done manually at the moment.
And earlier you mentioned that there will be new technologies, including more chemical recycling. Are there any other new technological developments that will help us in the future?
Well, yes, I think if we think about the way garments are put together at the moment, you imagine you take a typical garment and you think, right, okay, I want to get the lining out of this fabric, I want to get the outer fabric away from the other components, I want to get the metal zips out, I want to get the buttons off. Garments are actually quite complex because they're full of mixed materials, and they've been deliberately designed not to come apart very easily. So, well, in most cases. So I think that's one area where there has been a bit of activity around disassembly of garments, and obviously to make that economic, it has to be semi-automatic or automatic. So, for example, I've been working, for example, there are others working in this area too, looking at solubilizing seams, and we've been using microwave technology to rapidly degrade sewing threads within a few seconds to allow very easy separation of linings from outer fabrics, or pockets from jackets to take brands off, or to branding off, or logos or emblems off, or to drop zips and buttons off as well. And that's not just necessarily for recycling, but also to make it easier for garments to be reused. It's difficult to reuse a uniform if it's heavily branded, and rather than sending those uniforms to shredding factories to be made into fibre and be landfilled or recycled, if you can remove the emblem, remove the motif, remove the branding, then the garment can potentially be resold and used again. So that's one area. And then, as I mentioned, automatic sorting, few groups looking at that using various techniques to distinguish between different fiber types. I think there's one using hyperspectral imaging, near infrared, to identify polyester versus wool or cotton versus nylon, let's say. And then another area too, which I think is really interesting, is the use of RFID tagging, which is used by garment suppliers at the moment, but RFID tagging is now possible on flexible substrates, and this could allow garments and their provenance to be better understood at the end of life to help direct them to recycling and reuse markets more effectively, and that could have an influence on the way garments are sorted in the future, because there would be smart technology on board in the label, let's say, that could be read on a conveyor belt and then enable rational sorting of garments, in addition perhaps to what's being done by hand at the moment. At least that will go on for a little while yet, I guess.
Yeah, that would sound really exciting. I once wrote my master thesis on RFID, so I think that sounds really interesting.
Good.
And I think so far people have always just looked at the beginning of the supply chain of, tracing garments, but then not much once the garment is with the consumer and afterwards. So keeping that RFID chip or label inside of a garment would actually have a lot of more value. But I would like to get, in the beginning we already talked a little bit about the consumer, and I would like to dig a little bit deeper into that topic. How do you see, you always talk, we need a market. So what does the market for, or the demand for recycled textiles and clothing out of recycled textiles look like today? Is there a demand?
I think this is quite an interesting question, because I think what we have to remember is that many of the products that we buy now already contain recycled material. Many of them will contain post-industrial waste. So this is fiber that's generated during the manufacturing process and then put back in to the manufacturing process to make the virgin product. It's just that doesn't appear on labels. It's just a kind of natural way of ensuring that manufacturing is able to achieve high yield by making sure it wastes as little as possible. So one of the interesting questions around this is, and then another example is polyester. Of course, much of the polyester that we buy contains recycled plastic bottles. It's obviously from another source, but it has a recycled origin. So we're already using recycled material in first life product. And I suppose the question is, to what extent do we need to market the product effectively as recycled? In some cases, I guess that's useful commercially. In other cases, it might not be. So I'm really not a psychologist at all. But I do wonder whether I do think there are some interesting questions to ask here. Some of this will come down to regulation, of course, because we have to be transparent about what is in our products. It's very important. But if you ask me about markets for recycled materials, then as I've said, much of what we buy already has recycled content within it. I think that there is an opportunity also for recycled ranges to develop, so deliberately marketing and promoting a very high recyclate content. Clearly, there's a market for that as well, and we can see that happening already um, by various designers and through various brands as too. But in the mass market area, I think we need to have more discussions really about the best way to grow recycled fiber content consistent with the needs of each market and consistent with the regulation that applies in each particular territory.
Yeah, I think what you say is right, that it always depends on the consumer segment within the market. Because I remember one presentation at an IWTO event where they had produced like a nice looking coat out of recycled materials, but only once they told the consumers that it was made out of recycled, they actually stepped away from the garment. So
Yeah.
but then also I had an interview with Silvia Gambi from Cardato in Prato, and she observed that in the past, recycled wool garments was really considered like rags and something dirty, but that they have seen a lot of mindset change, that it was more and more valued. So yeah, I guess it depends on what kind of garment it is, what kind of consumer you want to target, etc.
Yeah, it is a tricky one because even the word shoddy, shoddy has fallen into use now as a kind of derogatory term for something that's not very good. So I think the words that we use and the way that it's presented are also quite important, so that we don't, if you like, impede the development that could take place otherwise.
But just today I saw Adidas presenting a sneaker that was made out of recycled plastic from the ocean.
Yes.
And I think also H&M always has some kind of recycled collection, like the conscious collection or something. So yeah, probably every brand needs to identify how and if they want to market recycled fabrics and garments. Excellent, Steve. I think we had a really nice discussion about textile recycling. And maybe before we close, can you give us maybe a little bit of an outlook if you see any particular opportunities for wool and recycling?
Yeah, I think one of the nice things that's been happening in the last couple of years is because of the renewed interest in recycling. I think there's more dialogue now going on or starting between the recycling and reuse supply chain, brand owners and other manufacturers. So I think, for many years, I had the distinct impression talking to many in the recycling industry that people had forgotten about them and they were struggling, and they just needed a little bit of help in terms of, for example, the design of products, a little bit of help in terms of directing waste streams in an appropriate way so that they could get hold of some of the materials that they wanted. So I think one positive thing, and it will continue, is this growing relationship building between the recycling industry and the rest of the wool manufacturing industry, for the sake of this conversation, which is clearly a good thing, and I think that will progressively mean that we focus more on the benefits and contributions of recycling and reuse to our industry and to us and to the circular economies that we're trying to build, and less on the kind of negatives of well, we should be recycling more and reusing more, and this slightly negative messaging, which it isn't particularly helpful. So without those dialogues, it's going to be very difficult, I think, to make rapid progress and to identify new markets and to increase the amount of material recycled at the end of life. I see that as entirely positive. So no longer is recycling kind of lurking in the shadows, and the rediscovery is not, if you like, for marketing flourish. It's because of a real sense of purpose, trying to improve the life cycle picture of wool garments, and that can only be a good thing.
Great, that's a very nice way of ending our discussion. Where can our listeners find out more about your work? Where should they go?
Being an academic type person, I can't help publishing things that I do. So if you just go onto the university website, and I put most stuff up there, and then with my colleagues in the IWTO tag, we are publishing fairly frequently on some of these issues around recycling and reuse. So there's a couple of book chapters have come out quite recently on that topic, and I think we'll continue to press that area. We are working very heavily to try and get much richer information, better data, more statistics on the activities within wool reuse and recycling in the major centres. And I think as we do that, we'll also be able to put out robust evidence about the impact it has on the full life cycle picture for a wool product and other products beyond the first life. So I think just keep your eye out.
Well, that's good that you publish things, because then we can all read about them and apply whatever you found in our businesses. So I'll make sure to link to all the things that you mentioned, so that people can find everything very easily. Well, thank you so much, Steve. I wish you continued success with all your research and the important work that you're doing, and we'll stay in touch.
Thank you, Elisabeth. And I'm so pleased that we weren't interrupted by phones or knocks or on the door or other noises. I was a bit worried. So I think all the signs have worked, so that's great. But nice to talk to you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Hopefully you enjoyed this interview with Stephen Russell. If you want to learn more about textile recycling as well as wool recycling, head on over to the show notes, where you can find all the links that were mentioned in today's episode. Visit elisabethvandelden.com/054. Once again, elisabethvandelden.com/054. One quick tip for you today: I have put together a wool calendar 2018 as a free download on my website. The wool calendar 2018 is a document that includes all relevant wool dates, fairs and events throughout the year 2018, as far as they are already available. This calendar can help you plan your 2018 and get you prepared for your social media activities as well as your travel well in advance. Download the calendar over at elisabethvandelden.com/wool-industry-calendar-2018. That is indeed a complicated link, so here it is once again. Visit elisabethvandelden.com/wool-industry-calendar-2018. But I will also make it available on the homepage of my website, so that it's much easier to find. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next week, and bye for now.